The Cuban Missile Crisis, a tense showdown. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 stands as one of the most perilous moments of the Cold War, bringing the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear conflict. Lasting for just 13 tense days in October, the crisis unfolded as the world watched with bated breath. This video delves into the origins, key events, major actors, strategies employed, and lasting implications of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a pivotal episode in the history of the Cold War. Background and historical context. 1. Cold War rivalry. The Cold War, which emerged after World War II, was characterized by ideological, political, and military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a global struggle for influence and dominance. 2. Fidel Castro's rise to power. In 1959, Fidel Castro and his revolutionary forces overthrew the Cuban government, leading to the establishment of a communist regime aligned with the Soviet Union. 3. Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961. The United States attempted to overthrow Castro's regime with the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. The operation failed, embarrassing the U.S. and strengthening Soviet-Cuban ties. 2. Soviet missiles in Cuba. 1. Missile deployment. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, capable of striking U.S. cities with nuclear warheads. The move was intended to counterbalance U.S. nuclear superiority in Europe. 2. U.S. discovery. U.S. intelligence agencies discovered the missile sites in October 1962, setting off alarm bells in Washington. 3. Key actors in the crisis. 1. President John F. Kennedy. President John F. Kennedy, who took office in 1961, faced the challenge of managing the Cuban Missile Crisis. He played a central role in shaping the U.S. response. 2. Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev initiated the missile deployment to Cuba and was central to the Soviet response during the crisis. 3. Fidel Castro. Cuban leader Fidel Castro, although not directly involved in the decision to deploy missiles, supported the Soviet move and was willing to risk war with the U.S. to defend Cuba. IV. Escalation of tensions. 1. President Kennedy's address, October 22, 1962. President Kennedy addressed the nation on television, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announcing a naval quarantine of the island to prevent further missile shipments. 2. Blockade in crisis atmosphere. The U.S. blockade, described as a quarantine, to avoid the term blockade, created a highly charged atmosphere. The U.S. and Soviet Union were poised for confrontation. Versus diplomatic initiatives. 1. Back-channel diplomacy. Both sides engaged in secret diplomatic communications to explore potential solutions to the crisis. These channels allowed for direct communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev. 2. Negotiations at the United Nations. The crisis was discussed at the United Nations, providing a platform for public statements and negotiations. Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, presented photographic evidence of the missile sites. V. Strategies and options. 1. Military options. President Kennedy's advisors presented various military options to address the crisis, including airstrikes on the missile sites and a full-scale invasion of Cuba. These options carried the risk of sparking a nuclear war. 2. Quarantine and diplomacy. Kennedy chose a combination of naval quarantine, diplomatic pressure, and negotiations to address the crisis. This strategy aimed to avoid direct military confrontation while pressuring the Soviets to withdraw the missiles. 7. Resolution of the crisis. 1. Khrushchev's decision. In a significant turn of events, Khrushchev decided to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for U.S. assurances not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. 2. Avoiding nuclear war. Khrushchev's decision to back down was motivated by a desire to avoid nuclear war and preserve his reputation. It marked a crucial moment in the crisis. 8. Aftermath and consequences. 1. Hotline communication. In the aftermath of the crisis, both superpowers recognized the need for direct communication to prevent future misunderstandings. The hotline between Washington and Moscow was established in 1963. 2. Nuclear arms race. The Cuban Missile Crisis underscored the dangers of the nuclear arms race and led to increased efforts to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons. World perilously close to nuclear war. It showcased the leadership, decision-making, and diplomacy of President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev. The crisis left an indelible mark on the Cold War, influencing arms control agreements, nuclear non-proliferation efforts, and the recognition of the need for communication and crisis management. As a cautionary tale, the Cuban Missile Crisis reminds us of the grave consequences of miscalculation and the imperative of resolving conflicts through peaceful means.